It was early morning in June 1947 when a strange message echoed across the Strait of Malacca. The radio operator on the Silver Star, an American cargo ship, picked up a faint, broken signal. He leaned closer to his receiver, trying to understand the words hidden behind the static. The voice on the other end was trembling. The words came slowly, like someone speaking from a dream. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Then there was silence. The operator stared at the radio, frozen. Just as he reached to check the frequency, another sound came, one final whisper, "I die." The message ended. No coordinates, no explanation. Just a dead line and a heavy quiet that filled the air. Captain Charles Baker of the Silver Star was informed immediately. "It's probably a mistake," one of his crew said, but the captain's instincts told him otherwise. They turned the ship toward the last known direction of the signal. Hours passed. The sea was calm, unnaturally calm, and a strange mist began to roll across the horizon. Somewhere within that endless white, a shadow began to form, the dark outline of another ship, silent and still. On its side, faintly visible through the rust and salt, were the words, "Ourang Medan," the ship that had sent the SOS. But something about it felt wrong. The way it floated, lifeless, like a coffin adrift on the sea. No one knew yet that they were about to board the deadliest mystery in maritime history. The Silver Star slowed as it approached the drifting ship. No movement came from the decks of the Ourang Medan. No smoke from the funnels. No sign of life anywhere. Only the slow, gentle sound of waves tapping against the hull. Captain Baker ordered a small team to board. Among them was James Ellery, the first mate, a quiet man who had spent years at sea. As their boat drew closer, Ellery could see how badly the ship had aged, its sides eaten away by rust, ropes torn, metal bent and blackened as though scorched by unseen fire. When they climbed aboard, a strange silence surrounded them. It was not the silence of calm weather, but of something deeper, a silence that seemed to listen back. The deck was littered with scattered tools, broken glass, and overturned barrels. It looked as if the crew had vanished in the middle of their work. "Hello," one of the sailors shouted. "This is the Silver Star. Anyone here?" No reply came, only the echo of his voice disappearing into the mist. Then Ellery noticed something near the rail, a shape lying face up. He stepped closer. It was a man. His eyes were wide open, staring toward the sky. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Everywhere they turned, they began to find more bodies. Sailors sprawled on the deck, arms raised as if to defend themselves from something invisible. No wounds, no blood, just pure, unmistakable fear. And the strangest thing of all, every body was cold, ice cold, even in the blazing tropical sun. Ellery whispered, "What in God's name happened here?" No one answered. The sea stayed quiet. The men moved cautiously across the deck, the old boards creaking under their boots. Every few steps, they discovered another frozen body, sailors, engineers, even the ship's cook lying near the galley doorway, his eyes wide, his hands twisted, as though he had died mid-scream. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The stench of salt and decay clung to the air, thick enough to taste. When Ellery reached the bridge, he felt a strange drop in temperature. The sunlight that had managed to pierce the fog seemed weaker here, as if something unseen was dimming it. He pushed the door open. Inside sat the captain of the Ourang Medan, slumped over his desk. His logbook lay open before him, the pen still between his fingers. His eyes were glassy, fixed on the compass. His expression, one of terror so deep it almost looked alive. Ellery glanced at the last line of the captain's log. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. Only a few words were clear enough to read. "They're coming from below." Then nothing. The rest of the page was blank. Ellery's skin prickled. He stepped back, turning toward the window that overlooked the deck below. From up there, he could see the bodies scattered in patterns, as if the entire crew had been struck down in the same instant. What could have done this? One sailor whispered behind him. Ellery didn't answer. But deep down, he had already begun to suspect that whatever had happened, it wasn't finished yet. Ellery gathered 2 of his men and made his way down toward the lower decks. The narrow stairwell smelled of oil and rust. Each step echoed through the hollow corridors, blending with the creaks of the ship. The air grew heavier as they descended, thicker with a faint metallic scent. When they reached the engine room, the silence deepened. The machinery was cold, coated in a thin layer of frost. Frost in the middle of the tropics. Ellery brushed a hand over one of the valves and flinched at the biting chill. The metal felt like ice. The engines themselves were motionless, but every gauge, every dial was locked in place, as if time had frozen the moment the crew had died. A single wrench lay on the floor, as though it had been dropped mid-task. One of the men muttered, "No one's been here for days." But Ellery shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Not days, hours." And then they saw them, 3 bodies near the boilers. The engineers. Each one sprawled across the floor, faces twisted with the same terror the others had worn. Their mouths hung open, their eyes wide. The youngest of the sailors bent down beside one of the bodies. "Sir," he said shakily, They're frozen." Ellery's heart began to pound. How could men freeze to death in heat like this? He turned his flashlight toward the far wall. That's when he noticed something else. Strange black marks burned into the steel. They spiraled outward like veins of lightning. "What is that?" one of them asked. Ellery didn't answer. He just said softly, "Let's get out of here." But the ship had other plans. As Ellery and his men climbed the narrow metal stairs, a sound stopped them in their tracks. It was faint, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere below the floor. Not like metal shifting or waves hitting the hull. It was deliberate, steady. Like someone knocking. The men froze. No one spoke for several seconds. The only thing they could hear was the low groan of the ship and that quiet tap, tap, tap. Ellery raised his lamp, scanning the engine room. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice echoed, thin and uncertain. No reply came. But the tapping grew louder, faster now, until it seemed to come from directly beneath their feet. He crouched and pressed his ear to the cold metal floor. It was impossible, but he could have sworn he heard breathing. "Ragged and uneven, sir," one sailor whispered. "Maybe someone's still alive." Ellery nodded, though every part of him hoped that wasn't true. They followed the sound through a narrow passage toward the cargo hold. The air grew sour, heavy, with a strange chemical scent. A few steps more, and they found it, a large steel hatch, sealed shut. The knocking had stopped. Ellery touched the hatch wheel. It was warm. Warmer than the rest of the ship. "Open it," one of the men asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet." And as they turned to leave, a whisper drifted through the corridor. Not loud, not even clear, but real. A voice, soft, human. "Leave before it wakes." Ellery's blood ran cold. None of the men moved. The voice came again, this time from behind the hatch. "Go," they ran. As Ellery and his men climbed the narrow metal stairs, a sound stopped them in their tracks. It was faint, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere below the floor. Not like metal shifting or waves hitting the hull. It was deliberate, steady. Like someone knocking. The men froze. No one spoke for several seconds. The only thing they could hear was the low groan of the ship and that quiet tap, tap, tap. Ellery raised his lamp, scanning the engine room. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice echoed, thin and uncertain. No reply came, but the tapping grew louder, faster now, until it seemed to come from directly beneath their feet. He crouched and pressed his ear to the cold metal floor. It was impossible, but he could have sworn he heard breathing. "Ragged and uneven, sir," one sailor whispered. "Maybe someone's still alive." Ellery nodded, though every part of him hoped that wasn't true. They followed the sound through a narrow passage toward the cargo hold. The air grew sour, heavy, with a strange chemical scent. A few steps more, and they found it, a large steel hatch, sealed shut. The knocking had stopped. Ellery touched the hatch wheel. It was warm. Warmer than the rest of the ship. "Open it," one of the men asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet." And as they turned to leave, a whisper drifted through the corridor. Not loud, not even clear, but real. A voice, soft, human. "Leave before it wakes." Ellery's blood ran cold. None of the men moved. The voice came again, this time from behind the hatch. "Go," they ran. They didn't stop running until they reached the mid-deck corridor, gasping for breath. The mist that had surrounded the ship earlier now seemed to have seeped inside, thin tendrils curling through the open hatches, brushing against the walls like living things. Ellery tried to steady his breathing. "We check the crew quarters," he said finally, "then we leave." The others nodded, though fear had drained the color from their faces. The corridor was lined with doors, each one slightly open. Inside, bunks hung crooked, papers scattered across the floor. On one wall, someone had scratched words into the paint, barely legible, deep gouges that read, "Don't pray, IT hears." Ellery stared at it for a long moment. Then one of his men called out from the far end of the hall, "Sir, over here." He hurried forward and stopped cold. There, near the doorway of what must have been the radio operator's cabin, lay a man curled on his side. His hands clutched a small silver cross pressed against his chest. His lips were blue, his face twisted as though caught mid-plea. Ellery knelt beside him. The man's fingers were so tight around the cross that they'd drawn blood. A faint trail of dark residue marked the floor near his hand, leading back toward the passage they had just come. From Ellery's lamp flickered. For a moment, the beam caught the man's eyes, wide open, staring at nothing, and something shimmered there. Almost like movement, reflected deep inside the pupils. He stepped back, heart pounding. "Let's go," he said quietly. "There's nothing left for us here." But as they turned away, The cross slipped from the man's hand and fell with a faint metallic ping from below the deck. The tapping began again. The door to the cargo hold was heavy, and when Ellery forced it open, the hinges screamed like something alive. A stale, bitter smell rolled out, a mixture of salt, fuel, and something darker. The air was heavy, suffocating, like it hadn't been breathed in weeks. Their flashlights swept across rows of wooden crates. Most were smashed open, their contents scattered and unrecognizable. Strange metallic cylinders, small glass jars, and sheets of burned paper written in a language none of them could read. What was this ship carrying? One of the men whispered. No one answered. The Ourang Medan wasn't listed for cargo of any kind. When they checked the records back on the Silver Star, whatever these crates held, it was not meant to exist on any manifest. Ellery approached one of the larger containers, still intact. Its lid was nailed shut and marked with symbols, crude, uneven shapes that looked almost tribal. Something about them made his stomach twist. He reached out and brushed off the dust. The metal beneath his fingertips was warm, pulsing faintly, as though something inside was alive. Captain, one sailor muttered nervously, "We shouldn't be here." Ellery hesitated. "You're right." But before they could move, the ship gave a deep groan, and one of the smaller crates toppled over. It hit the floor and split apart. Inside was nothing but black ash. And bones, human bones. The light from Ellery's lantern trembled as he backed away. The frost on the walls began to melt. Thin streams of water dripping onto the floor, though the air was still bitterly cold. He looked at the crates again, and in that stillness, a whisper floated from within one of them, so soft, so fragile, it barely existed. "Help me." Ellery stood frozen, his breath visible in the air. The whisper seemed to vanish as quickly as it came, leaving only the creak of the ship and the drip of water echoing through the hold. The other sailors looked pale, their eyes darting from the crates to the shadows that filled every corner. "What was that?" one of them asked quietly. Ellery swallowed hard. "Sounded like a person." He didn't finish the thought. He moved closer to the fallen crate, crouching beside the bones scattered on the floor. They were human, small, thin, like those of a young man. Around one of the bones was a torn piece of fabric, stamped faintly with military letters that were almost impossible to read. Then his light caught something else. Faint markings burned into the steel floor. Lines and circles arranged in patterns, carved deep as if melted into the metal. They stretched beneath the crates, linking one to another like a network of veins. "What is that?" the younger sailor whispered. Ellery followed the markings with his flashlight. They led all the way to the far end of the hold, where a single crate sat untouched, larger than the others, completely sealed in thick metal bands. On its side, someone had scratched 3 words with what looked like a knife. "Do not open." A cold breeze swept through the hold, flickering their lanterns. The mist around them began to swirl, moving in slow circles that mirrored the strange patterns on the floor. Then, from inside that sealed crate, came a soft, single knock. One of the sailors dropped his light. "That's it. We're done. We're leaving." Ellery didn't argue. For once, he agreed. But even as they turned to go, something scraped from inside the crate, long, slow, and deliberate. Something was awake. They backed away from the crate, their flashlights shaking in their hands. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick, almost alive, pressing against their ears. Ellery's heartbeat was so loud it drowned out everything else. Another sound came, a second knock. Then a low groan, like metal bending under pressure. "Something's inside," whispered one of the sailors. His voice trembled. "It's trying to get out." Ellery raised his hand. "No one touches it." But even as he said it, the ship lurched. A deep rumble vibrated through the deck beneath their boots. Dust fell from the ceiling. The Ourang Medan was moving, but not because of the sea. It was as though something within it was stirring, awakening. The air grew unbearably cold. Frost began to crawl across the walls again, racing up the pipes and metal rails. The men's breath came in sharp clouds. The lamps flickered once, twice, then burned weakly with a bluish light. From the crate came a sound that no human throat could make, a low, layered moan that rose into a scream and then cut off all at once. The younger sailor turned and ran toward the stairs, but he didn't make it far. His foot slipped on the wet metal and he fell hard. Ellery rushed to help him, but froze when he saw the sailor's eyes. They were wide open, white as glass, his body rigid and lifeless. Ellery stumbled back, his mind spinning. "We're leaving," he shouted. As they fled the hold, the air behind them began to hum, low and constant, a vibration that made the entire ship tremble. It sounded like a heartbeat, deep and mechanical. Whatever was in that crate, it was no longer sleeping. By the time Ellery and his men reached the upper deck, the air had changed. It was no longer cold. It was burning hot, as if the ship had drifted straight into the heart of a furnace. The fog around them glowed faintly orange, and the smell of smoke began to creep through the corridors. They stumbled into the open air, gasping. The deck that had been eerily silent before now crackled with heat. Flames had begun to rise from the lower vents, climbing in slow, twisting shapes. The men stared in disbelief. "It's the cargo hold," Ellery said, his voice hoarse. "It's burning." But that didn't make sense. The fire wasn't spreading like any normal blaze. It moved against the wind, licking the walls in patterns, as though drawn by unseen hands. And it made no sound, only a low, throbbing hum that vibrated deep inside their chests. Ellery shouted orders to the others, but no one seemed to hear. The air pulsed with a strange pressure that drowned out every word. He grabbed one man by the shoulders. "The lifeboats, now." The sailor nodded and ran to the side, only to stop suddenly, staring at something near the bow. Ellery followed his gaze. The captain of the Ourang Medan stood there, or what was left of him. His skin was cracked, blackened from the heat, but his body was rigidly upright. His face turned toward the flames below. His mouth was open, as though he were still screaming, though no sound came out. Then, without warning, a blinding flash erupted from the hatch to the cargo hold. The men fell to the deck as a wave of heat washed over them. Ellery looked up just in time to see fire explode out of the vents, pure, white fire that roared skyward, swallowing the fog and the sky in an instant. The ship screamed, not from metal or wind, but from something else. A deep, terrible moan rolled through the hull, like the sound of an ancient creature dying. Ellery grabbed the rail, eyes wide, as another blast of heat surged upward. "Get off the ship," he roared. The surviving men scrambled toward the lifeboats, their boots sliding on the blistering deck. One by one, they lowered the small crafts into the dark water. desperate to escape before the next explosion. The sea boiled where the fire touched it. Steam rose in clouds, curling into ghostly shapes that hung above the ship. Ellery was the last to climb down. He turned back once, staring at the Ourang Medan. The flames had reached the bridge. The radio antenna sparked, and for just a moment, he heard a whisper in his ear, faint but clear, "Stay." He froze. The voice didn't come from any of his men. It came from inside his head. The deck above him split apart with a crack like thunder, snapping him out of his trance. Ellery jumped into the lifeboat, landing hard. He shouted. As they pulled away, a final explosion ripped through the ship. The Ourang Medan lifted slightly out of the water, then came crashing down, its hull splitting open in a roar of light and fire. When the smoke began to clear, there was nothing left but drifting wreckage and silence. Hours passed. The men drifted aimlessly across a flat, lifeless sea. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only black waves and a faint orange glow on the horizon where the Ourang Medan once floated. No one spoke. Every few minutes, Ellery would glance back toward the smoke. The ship was gone, completely vanished beneath the waves. He whispered to himself, "What did we bring aboard?" One of the sailors finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's over?" Before Ellery could answer, a sound rolled across the water, faint like a heartbeat. They froze. The sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind or waves. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse coming from below their boat. Ellery leaned over the edge, staring into the dark water. There was nothing to see, only shifting shadows. Beneath the surface, then he saw it. Something massive moved below them, a shape that glowed faintly white, rippling like smoke underwater. It circled once, twice, then sank into the blackness. The sound faded by dawn. When a passing freighter finally found them, the survivors were barely conscious. Ellery tried to speak, but could only whisper one thing before he lost his voice forever. "It's still down there." The Dutch freighter Silver Star reached the coordinates just after sunrise. The sea was unnaturally calm. A thin mist hung over the waves, and the air smelled faintly of burnt oil. The crew stood silently along the rail as the wreckage of the Ourang Medan came into view. She floated on her side, half submerged, her hull scorched black and split near the middle. No smoke, no movement, just the steady creak of metal cooling in the morning air. The captain of the Silver Star raised his binoculars. "No sign of life," he muttered, "but she's still afloat." A boarding team was assembled, 6 men, cautious but curious. They rowed across the still water, each stroke echoing in the silence. When they reached the ghostly ship, they tied up alongside and climbed the ropes onto the deck. What they found there froze them in place. Bodies, dozens of them, lay scattered across the deck, eyes wide open, mouths twisted into silent screams. Every face bore the same expression of pure terror. Not a single mark or wound, just death. The men moved slowly, whispering prayers under their breath. One of them pointed to the bridge. "Radio's still up there," he said. "Maybe we'll find out what happened." As they climbed the stairs, a faint crackle came from the broken radio speaker, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. Then a single voice, distorted and cold, whispered through the static, "Help me." The men rushed into the radio room. The equipment was blackened, wires melted, smoke-stained glass cracked. Yet the red transmission light flickered, weakly, but alive. The operator's chair was still occupied. The man inside was long dead, his hand frozen over the Morse key, his eyes staring directly at the transmitter. "Cut the power," one of the rescuers said nervously. But before anyone could move, the radio sparked again. A voice, calm, almost emotionless, began to play through the speaker. Not a transmission this time. A recording, SOS. From the Ourang Medan crew dead, possibly something inside. "I am dying." The static crackled, then silence. The rescuers exchanged looks. "That's the message we received," one said quietly. "The one that brought us here." They didn't have long to think. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the ship. The deck shifted beneath their feet. One of the men ran to the window. "Sir," the lower Holdit's glowing. Below deck, light poured from the cracks in the floor, bright, white, pulsing in rhythm like a heartbeat. Without another word, the captain shouted back to the boats. "Now." The boarding team scrambled back to the deck, the wood beneath them burning hot to the touch. Smoke was rising again, not from fire, but from the metal itself. They leaped into their lifeboat, rowing frantically as the Ourang Medan began to list heavily to one side. The strange glow now shone from every crack, every porthole, until the entire hull was alive with light from the distance. The crew of the Silver Star watched as the ghost ship gave a final thunderous shudder. Then, without warning, she exploded. The blast ripped through the air with a blinding white flash, sending a column of flame and smoke high into the clouds. When it cleared, nothing remained but blackened water and fragments of wood floating aimlessly across the waves. The rescuers stared in silence. No one spoke. No one could. In the following days, their report would be simple. The ship exploded due to an unknown cause. But among the survivors, whispers continued. They said that sometimes, on still nights, the Silver Star's radio would come alive on its own, and through the static, a familiar voice could still be heard. "Help me."